On February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. Having been previously occupied by the USSR for over 70 years, Ukraine had long prepared for such an eventuality. They're not alone, however. North of Ukraine are 3 other countries that have just as strained and tense relationship with Russia: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This is a story of those 3 countries and their partnership with NATO. Many think of them as former Soviet states when in fact Russia is their greatest enemy. My unit, the 169th Field Artillery Brigade, went to the Baltics to participate in Defender Europe. The exercise is a carryover of Reforger, an exercise from the 80s which was built to ensure that NATO could deploy forces to West Germany quickly if a conflict broke out between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. After the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, the exercise stopped until about 12 years ago when it became Defender Europe. The intent since then has changed a bit, but the overarching goal of maintaining strong relations and a ready force with our NATO allies has not. Like most Americans, the Baltics were something completely foreign to me, and I didn't realize their place in the grand scheme of the Cold War. Ignorantly, we were taught everything east of Germany was the USSR. When you look at old maps, that is how it was often depicted. But these images are a gross oversimplification of the brutal history. It was a turbulent time for the Baltics after the Soviets left. They each had to build their own economies, militaries, and governments from the ground up. And although they've come a long way in 30 years, the aftermath of this forced occupation can still be felt through the remnants of old Soviet-era architecture and memorabilia left behind. This video came down to one question: what would it take for a country to build up a modern fighting force in less than 30 years? Although our units were spread throughout the Baltics, myself and the brigade headquarters were located in Estonia. So that is where our story begins. As a Field Artillery Brigade, our primary mission was to integrate with local forces and receive and execute fire missions. In other words, we would simulate a global war where our brigade supports multiple fronts simultaneously. This integration is referred to as interoperability by the armed forces. Being able to work together is critical to winning wars, and the Army has gone so far as to write a regulation defining it and its broader goals. In just 30 pages, the word is used 300 times.
And it's one that helps us build interoperability.
Although there are a few different definitions, it essentially means to be able to operate effectively and efficiently as a component of the joint force. Back in the day of World War II, this meant things more basic, such as ensuring that we were using the same munitions so we could share rounds more easily. In today's world, this means ensuring our systems can talk to one another. Wanting to know a bit more about the history of this exercise as it is related to Estonia, I went up to their capital, Tallinn. There I met with Lieutenant Colonel Jerad with the Maryland Air National Guard. While it may seem strange that I would talk to an American service member about Estonia, it made sense given his unique role. You see, he is what is called a Bilateral Affairs Officer. It's a type of position that is unique to the National Guard and directly relates to what we call our State Partnership Program. The SPP has been around since the early 90s and began as a direct result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Incidentally, the Baltic states were the first 3 countries inducted into the program. A bilateral affairs officer, like Lieutenant Colonel Hand, is sort of like an ambassador of any given state's military to that individual country. We discussed several points ranging from the countries involved to the history of Defender in the Baltics. But the point that caught my attention the most was how the Maryland National Guard has been working on integrating systems with Estonia.
As Estonia's focus has continued to evolve above the tactical level, Maryland has worked hard to mature our integration. The Digital Liaison Detachment is a good representation of that because their capability is intended to connect a partner or ally headquarters to up to a U.S. Corps, which is what we're attempting to do or focused on doing in this exercise.
So essentially, the Maryland National Guard's efforts mirrored that of our own over the past year. Ultimately, we both had the same mission of being able to make our systems communicate effectively with the Estonians. At the time of this interview, we still had not yet achieved full digital interoperability. After I finished up my conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Hand, we chatted more about the project and some of the goals we had for it. To help emphasize the importance of this partnership, he recommended that I check out a memorial nearby called Maarjamäe. I had run by the memorial a few months prior while doing a site visit. I knew that it was meant to honor those that had died at the hands of communism, but I didn't understand its significance until I actually stopped and saw how many names were on the wall. So when I took the time to go through the memorial, I saw the names of the Estonians who had been killed, sent to work camps, never to return. So the first thought when you walk in here, not all the panels have names on them, and then towards the end, it essentially says the victims of communist terror is not final. The investigation continues. So they expect, as they investigate, to continue to add names to this list. Why was post-World War II history so focused on the Berlin Wall? How could the West turn a blind eye to the rest of Eastern Europe? After returning to Tapa, I tried to learn some more about the history of the base. I had heard of Old Tapa and New Tapa, but I didn't know much about this distinction and why it was important. My initial research taught me a couple of key things about the base. First, the base was a key military installation for Estonia during their War of Independence in 1918. Second, the base was converted to a Soviet military base in the 1940s upon their occupation. Third, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the base reverted back to an Estonian military base in 1991. In my search for answers, I found an Estonian soldier who had personally been part of the modernization of the Estonian military, Major Meelis, Laanements. Together, we toured the old base and the new base, but it was the small, unassuming plaque at the Tapa train station that captured my attention.
Tapal on tõesti olnud väga huvitav ajalugu. Praegult me seisame ajaloolise Tapa raudteejaama juures. Raudtee ja hiljem sõjavägi, nimelt soomusrongide rügement, on siis ilmestanud Tapa linna arengut läbi 150 aasta. Praegu siin Tapa raudteejaama seinal on siis näha mälestusmärk, mis siis on püstitatud soomusrongide rügemendi võitlejatele, kes siis vabastasid Tapa linna 1919. aastal. Hiljem 1920. aastatel on siis Tapa linn olnud koduks soomusrongide rügemendile kuni siis 1940. aasta Vene Föderatsiooni ja Nõukogude Liidu okupatsioonile.
As we walked through the old base, we could see the remnants of buildings that the Estonians had built back in the 1920s, which were left to decay by the Soviets. A similar fate then fell upon the buildings that the Soviets left behind. Rather than spend time demolishing and building on top of them, the Estonians decided to start anew down the road. Before my interview with Major Laanements, I didn't have much of a vision for this video. But after talking to him and learning about Estonia's military history, I thought to myself, what if we could do the same for Latvia and Lithuania? Since I had less than 2 weeks left in the region, this seemed like an impossible task. But I reached out to the Latvian and Lithuanian embassies to see if they could support such a request. While they looked for someone, we made our way down to Lithuania, bypassing Latvia for the time being, for the next part of the exercise. Our unit down there was 1st Battalion, 109th Field Artillery Regiment, based out of Pennsylvania. Their weapon system is the M109 howitzer. When we arrived, our soldiers were set up at a range next to the German and Lithuanian field artillerymen, both of which were firing German Panzer howitzers, and all were receiving missions from the Lithuanian Joint Air-Ground Coordinating Tower, where we had a brigade liaison team linking the Lithuanian command to our headquarters in Tapa, Estonia. True to the overarching goal of interoperability of the exercise, our soldiers there were receiving and executing missions that originated from the Lithuanian army. Another interesting coincidence from this entire exercise was the role of each state and each country. I talked a bit about the state partnership program, but fate would have it that Pennsylvania is the state partner of Lithuania. This meant I had a chance to talk to our own soldiers who had been building a relationship with Lithuania for years. For this, I spoke to my own counterpart for the 1st of the 109th Field Artillery Regiment, Captain Jeremy Whitmer.
One of the major things that we've learned is their sheer dedication to country and their willingness to improve and their wanting to improve. Sometimes we lose when we're training back home. You can lose focus on some of not necessarily why you're doing it, but you lose some of the morale. And here, the morale is just, everywhere, and everybody's just continuing to improve, continuing to want to improve, and it's just the commonality that we all have as artillerymen.
Once in Lithuania, I met Major Ricardas Kalinauskas. Incredibly, he was in an identical position to that of Major Laanements. He had been with the unit since its foundation and now served as its battalion commander. For continuity, I asked Major Kalinauskas the same questions. This led me to learn that at one point in time, Lithuania was the largest country in Europe due to their fighting prowess. While they were clearly only a fraction of their once immense size, it was obvious that they kept that fighting spirit alive and prided themselves in being forward-thinking fighters. For the Lithuanians, they knew that building alliances and learning from allies was instrumental in advancing their skills and capabilities. Major Kalinauskas explained that their older officers had been trained by the Russian military, and so naturally were trained to fight with Russian tactics and procedures. When they reestablished their independence, they sought out partners from whom to learn new tactics from. They first partnered with Denmark in 2001 and trained on 105mm howitzers. After 15 years on that system, they sought out a more modern, longer-range system. For this, they partnered with the Germans and secured Panzer howitzers.
It was not so easy to make transition from 105 to 155 because this is pretty sophisticated system. It requires more skill, more knowledge, and again, in Lithuania, we didn't have any experts in this platform. So we decided to send our students to Germany, to the artillery school, and only after we were capable to operate this system.
Less than 72 hours after we arrived in Pabrade, we were back on the road and driving up to Estonia. Again, on a short deadline, we had to blow past Latvia to get to our next destination, Estonia's largest island, Saaremaa. There we met with an active duty unit that was assigned to us for the exercise, 1st Battalion, 14th Field Artillery Regiment from Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Their weapon system is the M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, better known as HIMARS. Incidentally, it's the same system being used by Ukraine and is also the latest addition to the Estonian military. Our specific mission on the island was the first of its kind and proved to be historical for NATO and our allies. As the name implies, field artillery has always been associated with long-range combat and continually strives for increased precision and the furthest possible range. Having further range can mean supporting multiple areas of conflict simultaneously, and as demonstrated by this exercise with multiple allies at the same time as well. So this live-fire exercise was designed to test digital interoperability by executing a fire mission that originated from the Estonian fire system and then traveled to our fire system and terminate with kinetic effects. The fire mission began with Estonia Command in Võru, where they would identify a target and send up a request for support. That request would travel north 108 kilometers to our headquarters in Tapa, where it would be processed and sent 243 kilometers to a HIMARS crew on Saaremaa. Finally, the crew would launch a rocket at a target in the Baltic Sea. This may sound simple when the average person can make a phone call halfway around the world at any given time. But for the military, the process requires maximum encryption and security. In order for this mission to succeed, we had to figure out how to make 3 different network nodes talk together, something never before attempted in the Baltics. To be honest, we weren't sure if we'd be able to make it happen. We had a lot of eyes on us from leadership, and we worked long and hard to succeed. In the end, we successfully fired 12 rockets. Although I knew I was going to spend some time on Saaremaa Island, I didn't think I was going to do any more interviews while I focused on our live fire exercise. That is, until I met Timo Saarastik. Timo first caught my attention because he had referred to some of his peers in Võru as Estonian. He spoke about them as if they were from a different country altogether. When I asked him about it, he bluntly said, "I am not Estonian, I'm an islander." And he meant that through and through. His family had been on the island for 400 years, and owns a sizable portion of the island. So I asked him to talk a bit about the different cultures and his role in the Estonian Defense League.
As an officer in Estonia, being in active duty defense forces, it's an everyday service. That was my bread and butter. In Estonian Defense League, I would draw similar lines with the US version of National Guard, with an exception for my everyday work. I work in a civilian field, and I do this as my hobby, as my service, as my duty towards the country, and I do it for free.
Cultural differences, islanders versus mainland. Can you expand on some of the things that an Estonian would notice between the two?
We are a different breed. You maybe notice it by seeing all the people around the island being really friendly, really happy. We consider ourselves not so much Estonians, but being islanders. On the island, 80% of the population is local islanders, so we talk differently, we walk differently. When I go to mainland Estonia, Estonians instantly recognize I'm not an Estonian, but I'm from the island, and particularly from this island. We keep together, we keep it strong, the community is strong, we like it.
Timo was passionate and intense. He was also realistic. He was quick to acknowledge the clear disadvantage Estonia has in a face-to-face war with Russia. But he also had no qualms about fighting to the bitter end to defend his land and his family. Of all the places to say goodbye to on this trip, I think Saaremaa was the hardest to leave. The calm, tranquil moments really stuck with me, and the people were so welcoming. I saw a lot of similarities between their community and my hometown back in Washington State. Once we got off the ferry, we had another long drive down to Latvia, where we finally got to see our M777 howitzer unit, the 1st Battalion, 119th Field Artillery Regiment from Michigan, the state partner of Latvia. This meant that, again, we were able to talk to a unit that had interacted with their host nation for several years. And, again, in an impressive display of interoperability, 1st the 119th was receiving and executing missions that directly originated from Latvian command. Major Ryan McCann was the unit's operations officer and had been to Latvia several times over the years as part of their state partnership. While he personally didn't see all of the unit's growth, his team had been there when Latvia had nothing more than a small field artillery company and has followed its growth to a battalion-sized element today.
14 to 15, we brought a battery over. Camp Adige, the training area we're at now, was about the third the size it is now. They had company and battalion mortars, and that is about the extent of their fire support experience. Now they've got a whole battalion worth of M109s, and they're firing right next to us.
My next interview ended up setting the stage the most out of all of my interviews. I could find facts and figures, but I couldn't place them in the greater cultural understanding of Baltic history. I was fortunate then to meet with the official Latvian military historian, Dr. Valdis Kuzmins, at the site of one of Latvia's most famous battles. Here and more, this was unassuming, yet valuable terrain to the Latvians. During World War II, Latvian roads were of great strategic importance to both the Russians and the Germans, and Moor was just one of many sites where battles were fought over them. Before going into the interview, I wasn't quite sure how this would play out. While researching the battle, I found that the Latvians fought on behalf of the Nazis, and I didn't know what to make of this. My conversations with Dr. Kuzmins taught me more about the political climate at the time, and the thing that really stood out to me was that the Latvians, along with the other Baltic states, were placed in a lose-lose situation.
Yes, unfortunate tragedy of Latvian soldiers in World War II is that we didn't have a chance. We didn't have a chance to fight as a Latvian army against invaders. So in 1939 we were forced to let in Soviet forces, and we did that same thing again in 1940. So when Germans invaded in 1941, the Latvian soldiers had only unfortunate choice: which enemy I will fight against. And both choices, Nazi Germany or Soviet Union, were the right choices. But for them, unfortunately, they did not have the good thing to fight for. They believed, they had dreams that we are fighting for a free and independent Latvia, but today we know that wouldn't be the case, even if Adolf Hitler would want.
Their actions taught them a valuable lesson. The lesser of two evils is still evil. Dr. Kuzmins told me that in Latvia they've gone as far as to reinforce this hard lesson through legislation today. Under Section 25 of their national security law, they outlined that in the case of unexpected military aggression, that the commander of each unit shall undertake military defense measures without awaiting a separate decision. Furthermore, demonstration of armed resistance may not be prohibited during a war, military aggression, or occupation. In other words, if Russia suddenly attacks, a commander is authorized to immediately engage without a formal declaration of war and to disregard any order to surrender. One of the points Dr. Kuzmins made mirrored that of Major Kalinauskas in Lithuania, the need for strong allies.
We are a neutral country, we will not be part in any of that fighting that started in 1939, and that was a big mistake. Because when we had to surrender in 1940, one reason was we were left alone. So when we regained our independence in the early 1990s, we made sure that we will join NATO as quickly as possible and will be part with as many allies as possible.
We welcome them into the ranks of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
And we will join in any operations that NATO is running, whatever it is. And that was a big thing, and that's why we feel more safe today.
My talk with Dr. Kuzmins lasted hours, and he answered every difficult question I gave him with ease. Although I've cut out a great deal for brevity, there was one site that Dr. Kuzmins specifically asked me to highlight in this video since it was so personally significant to the company commander, First Lieutenant Rolands Kovnekto, whose first-person account has helped preserve the history of this era.
And we are standing at the place, and this machine gun nest, as you can see right now, was restored by Rolands himself in early 1990s, and that is the thing he was most proud of. When he arrived in those positions, the German engineers prepared this machine gun nest to shoot that direction, and he said, no, that is wrong, because the Soviet forces could engage my machine gunners. So he built a wall, and he said, okay, your primary field of fire is this direction to cover my 3rd platoon, and you stay low, you are not showing your position. And the thing he was very proud of, that during the whole battle, it was 48 hours of heavy fighting, he lost only one machine gunner as wounded. And that's why he was recognized as a good company commander, but because he cared for his NCOs, for his soldiers, and they kind of survived during that whole battle. And that kind of shows the attitude. They're not so much fighting for Adolf Hitler, also they were dressed in Waffen-SS uniforms. They were fighting for each other, and they were trying to survive, at the same time kind of dreaming that they are fighting for a free and independent Latvia.
A day after my discussion with Dr. Kuzmins, I met Colonel Sandris Gaugers, the Land Forces Mechanized Infantry Brigade commander. Of all of my interviews, this one was the most natural. I felt comfortable asking more pointed questions, which led to him saying several profound things that stick with me to this day. In essence, I learned that day, it is better to die for something you believe in than to die for something you don't. Colonel Gaugers brought up several interesting points, but one of his earliest points was that the best preparation for war is actual experience.
Look at the early 90s, that's a completely different thing what we have today. Over 30 years, we went through the Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, for 20 years, gaining the military experience. However, realizing today, with the threat we currently have, that Iraq and Afghanistan is not really a conventional fight. We've been really concentrating on the conventional warfighting. So how do we do, the near peer, or how do we, as a small country, fighting against Russia? So that's where our main effort has been laying for the last 5-6 years.
In addition to gaining experience, one of the biggest challenges that Latvia has faced is transitioning to an offensive mindset rather than defensive. For Colonel Gauders, Latvia has finally been able to make this shift thanks to their partnership with NATO and more specifically, the Enhanced Forward Protection Team.
The big thing I think, and the big change what has happened in last years, having the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group here with offensive capabilities has changed our mindset nationally. Because for us, sitting next to Russia, it's always been about defense. So how do we hit and run, rather than hit and bounce them from the side with offensive actions. And that thought we never had because we don't have that capability nationally. Simple as that, the offensive capability is not there. With having EFP, that has brought us to understanding that we need to build the offensive capability ourselves.
He held no trust for Russia, and while he had faith in NATO, he knew that it was ultimately the Baltic states' responsibility to prepare themselves for any eventuality. I would even question his confidence in a coalition larger than the Baltic states. I have no doubt this is also a concern all Eastern European countries share.
If the Russian tanks are driving around Latvia and there are no political orders in place, the military force needs to resist. General rule is we will resist in one or another form as long as it takes. The Ukrainian will to fight and that spirit what that nation has, and I can fully understand it, there is no way Latvians are going back to the Soviet Union. We rather die fighting than let the Russians in and say that we love them and we now gonna all live in peace and harmony. There is no way that's happening. So generally, the resistance piece gonna be rather easy for us.
As we left the Dazi, I felt a certain measure of relief. At this point, the exercise was over. Each unit had successfully operated with 3 different countries, processes, procedures, and technical requirements. Now it feels simple, but at the time it felt like an impossible task. On top of that, I had managed to build this video highlighting those efforts. I reflected back to my earliest encounters with the Estonian Defense Forces and thought of Lieutenant Colonel Erike Rustenrum, the first person I spoke to when planning began for Defender. We met in the Baltic Defense College in Tartu. This was an appropriate place to meet for a couple of reasons. One, this is where all Estonian officers train, and so it seemed like a fitting place to talk about such an important exercise. The other reason was that Tartu was the initial site where Estonia secured their freedom in 1920 as they won their independence. For Lieutenant Colonel Rustenrum, he was immensely satisfied with the outcome of Defender and felt that it was far more successful than originally intended.
But I think we got much more than we initially thought we will get. We ended up with digital fires, which was something we didn't think that will happen. So that's way more than we expected from that exercise. And all the linkages and the integration from the US side into our HQs and all the technical solutions, they were very good to execute those fire missions.
Once home, I reflected back on my interviews. I looked for any sort of overall trends or lessons learned. All 3 countries see the need for long-range precision fires. Latvia has the youngest Field Artillery Battalion, whereas both Estonia and Lithuania have been working on increasing their long-range precision fires capability for years. Another lesson I learned was the emphasis on organic leadership development. All 3 mentioned at one point or another that they are just now getting to their first generation of Baltic-bred generals. The experience and guidance they're now receiving has made it far easier for the junior officers to grow and succeed. The last lesson was partnership and teamwork. All 3 understood the need for strong alliances before they re-established their independence. They secured those positions at the earliest possible moment by way of entering NATO and the state partnership Partnership Program. Together, they've since strengthened those bonds and built a stronger, more lethal fighting force. Looking back on the exercise, I'm proud of our brigade and what we accomplished. Our units integrated flawlessly with their partner countries and executed their missions with passion. It is difficult to convey just how much went into this exercise, not just from our unit, but the rest of the countries involved. Our brigade's mission accounted for less than 10% of the total exercise. And looking back on how much work it took for us to succeed, I'm amazed thinking of all the work required from everyone else to make this a success.
Hi, I'm General Dan Hokanson, the 29th Chief of the National Guard Bureau. And for all the service members of our Baltic allies, please know that we stand in solidarity with you against all NATO adversaries.